All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to spend this week talking about ceremonial speaking. We'll get a little bit of a break from deliberation. Hopefully you all have a good start on your deliberation projects. Ceremonial speaking is fun. It's a good way to close out the semester, to at least get close to closing out the semester. So I'm excited for you all to try your hand at ceremonial speaking, hopefully in lab. One of the reasons why I enjoy teaching ceremonial speaking is because if there's nothing else that you all have latched onto all semester, ceremonial speaking is something that just about everybody, or if maybe everybody in this room, will do at some point. You might not be doing it tomorrow, but probably in the next 5 or 10 years, you'll give several ceremonial speeches. A lot of you, if you have friends and family members, you're going to have weddings, you're going to have lots of other life cycle events, and ceremonial speeches are a good time to mark occasions of transition. We use speech to recognize that what used to be happening in the past is no longer applying in the present or the future. There's some big change that's coming. Maybe somebody graduated, maybe somebody retired. There's some big life change, and we mark that with the ceremonial speech to recognize that this is kind of a weird moment. And speech can be really powerful in those moments because speech has a strong power to be very emotional. So we're going to spend some time today talking about ceremonial speaking. We're going to see some examples of ceremonial speeches. I really enjoy teaching ceremonial speeches by what not to do. I've seen a lot of very bad examples of ceremonial speeches, and so I want you all to have an opportunity to think about how you would give some of these different speeches if you were asked to do them. We're going to watch some examples. Some of them might be better than others. You get to decide for yourselves what you like and don't like about ceremonial speeches, but we're going to start there today and see where it takes us. So you might remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about deliberation, I went back to Aristotle and I gave you Aristotle's 3 main genres or times of argument, when arguments happen. And Aristotle was talking about this mostly in the legal sense. They were looking at a lot of the speeches that were given in ancient Greece, a lot of the theory that came around speech in ancient Greece had to do with politics and law. They had a lot to do with who was guilty and who was innocent. So we've been spending a lot of our time in the top realm here with deliberative speaking, and deliberative speaking is usually concerned with the future. It's concerned with what should or shouldn't be the case. When we're talking about forensic speaking, a lot of that happens in the past. A lot of that was deciding whether a client was innocent or guilty in the Greek law court system. We can think of lots of occasions in our contemporary time where we're dealing with the past and giving speeches about the past that aren't necessarily about guilt or innocence. For instance, you might recognize that there are anniversaries that happen. So on Sunday, it was the 5th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. I imagine there were several very good speeches to watch about that. Boston's had a kind of love affair with preserving that memory of that bombing. And so it's important that we recognize that there's different speeches for different occasions. And future-oriented speech is usually persuasive in the sense that it tries to tell us what we should be doing. Past-oriented speech is usually figuring out how we got to the present. Right in the middle of that is what we called epideictic speech. In ancient Greek, epideictic is a word that's roughly translated as ceremonial speaking. And it's mostly concerned with the present, although it's often somewhere wedged between the past and the future. A lot of people would like to separate these out and say these are separate genres, and we can never talk about more than one time at a time. And so what we have here is epideictic speech is kind of wedged in between the past and the future. And a lot of 20th century scholars were saying it's not really the case that ceremonial speaking is only about the present moment, but oftentimes it'll use elements of the past or it'll be looking forward toward the future. So a few weeks ago in here, we watched Ronald Reagan's speech after the Challenger explosion. And I told you that part of Reagan's speech was a eulogy, and that fits right in the realm of epideictic. It's a ceremonial speech. Eulogies are trying to remember the dead, and so he was trying to remember and honor the people whose lives were lost on the Challenger. But he was also, in the deliberative realm, really trying to preserve the future of the space program. A lot of people were really concerned that the space program was getting out of hand and that it wasn't really safe, and there was this question of whether we still needed it. And that's a debate that even today we're still having. A lot of people, when they talk about the economic recession, talk about whether we need NASA. And so epideictic speech is one of those times where we can actually fuse the past, the present, and the future, and because of that, it ends up usually being very powerful. So we've got these different genres of speech here. And one of the interesting things about these genres of speech is that they differ a lot from the other speeches that I've been asking you to give in this class. They differ a lot from the other speeches that you would give in sort of professional settings. In most of those settings, you'll have informative speeches or persuasive speeches. If you're doing an informative speech, you get to wear your teacher hat. You get to teach your audience something that they didn't already know. You're presenting new evidence. You're showing your expertise, and you're trying to get your audience to learn something new. When we're in the realm of persuasive speaking, we're trying to persuade other people to change their attitudes or their values or their beliefs or their practices. And sometimes there are elements of informative and persuasive speaking when it comes to ceremonial speaking. But a lot of times our ceremonial speeches are actually serving different purposes. And I've listed a whole bunch of them up here on the board for you. There's lots of different occasions that call for epidictic speech. And we use epidictic speech really to mark transition moments in our lives. And so sometimes we're celebrating things, sometimes we're remembering things. There's lots of emotions: happy, sad, angry, frustrated, confused, excited. You can name any emotion that you want. Lots of different purposes that ceremonial speeches tend to serve. And so it's not necessarily just the case that they're informative or persuasive. Now, when we're talking about ceremonial speaking, a lot of times we have the same concepts that we've been having this whole semester. What I find really interesting with a lot of people who do ceremonial speeches after taking a public speaking class is I find that a lot of times people will take our concepts that we've been talking about all semester, and they'll decide that they suddenly don't apply when it comes to ceremonial speeches. And I want to remind you that there are a couple key things that can really help you in these moments. The first is obviously the 5 canons. I've tried to drill that into you all semester. The 5 canons are really your process for how to give the speech from beginning to end, how to write it, how to revise it, how to practice it, how to deliver it. A lot of people, when it comes to the 5 canons, when it comes to ceremonial speaking, will throw the 5 canons out the door. And they'll say, well, it doesn't matter if I give an impromptu speech because I'm speaking from the heart, and I'll just say whatever matters to me, and the audience will just like it. A lot of people will do impromptu speeches, and those impromptu speeches don't go very well because people will ad-lib things in that they don't mean to say. They'll say things that embarrass themselves or the people that they're honoring. Other times, when people give ceremonial speeches, they'll decide to deliver it from a manuscript. They'll say, okay, this is an important moment, so I'm going to make sure that I have my whole speech written out word for word, and I'm going to deliver it from a manuscript, and the audience will just deal with the fact that my delivery may not be the most engaging because it's really the words that matter. And I find that that's also usually a problem when people give ceremonial speeches, because a lot of times they'll still do what you do when you're giving an informative or persuasive speech. They will sit and read their outline in a very flat tone, talking to the paper and not to their audience. And so I want you to remember that the 5 canons are something that you have available to you. And a lot of times when you have ceremonial speeches, you don't necessarily get a whole lot of time to walk through the 5 canons. The nice thing about them is where they still have pretty high standards for memory and delivery, they don't necessarily have the highest standards for invention. That is, you're not necessarily doing research for a ceremonial speech. There usually aren't a whole lot of details that you need to remember and get exactly right, or specific passages that you need to get word for word. If you decide to include those things, you'll probably use them more sparingly than you would, and so you can devote some time to the later canons. Another way of thinking about ceremonial speaking is through Lloyd Bitzer's rhetorical situation. I mentioned that Lloyd Bitzer's concept of exigence usually deals with a public problem. And so when you're giving a persuasive speech, usually you've identified the problem, and you're going to persuade the audience that it is a problem and that you have the solution to that problem. When we're talking about ceremonial speeches, it's usually not the case that we're grounding our speech in a problem, but really we're grounding our speech in an occasion. We're trying to figure out what is the moment, what is the reason, what is the purpose that we're all here today. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to X, right? From there are usually audience expectations, there are usually occasion expectations, and it's pretty easy to violate some of those expectations without realizing that you violated them. We're going to walk through some genres of ceremonial speaking, and you'll see what I'm talking about, but it's very easy to have a bad wedding toast or bad other ceremonial speeches. I want you to learn how to do them well, and so another way of thinking about them are, what is the exigence that brought us all together, who's in my audience, and what are the constraints that I might face that would change how I give my speech. And the third thing, and the main thing that I really want you to take away from this lesson on ceremonial speaking, is that ceremonial speaking is about audience analysis. A lot of people will get very excited about ceremonies that they're celebrating or commemorating. And when you're caught up in the moment, it's easy to go back to that default of being self-centered in the way that I talked about it when we talked about audience analysis. It's not that we're all egotistical, but it's more that it's easier for us to talk about ourselves and not so easy to necessarily think about what the audience needs to hear. What I really want you to do is to try and recognize that the moment is bigger than you, and that sometimes it's more important for you to talk about things that will engage your audience than it is to talk about everything that you would want to share in that moment. So there's a lot of different things to keep in mind. I don't have a whole lot of new content for you, but you'll see how some of the old content applies to some of the ceremonial speeches that we're talking about today. Now, aside from that, there's kind of a curse of teaching public speaking as long as I have. And some of you, just to have, by virtue of having taken this class, will start to feel this curse a little bit. It's very hard for me to sit through a ceremonial speech and not be grading in the back of my head. I've been to a lot of weddings recently, and I usually need to get up and leave the room or at least hide my face because people will watch me, and like one of my former mentors says, I was born without the poker face gene, and so I don't necessarily have the best way of hiding my emotions, and people know that I teach speech for a living, and so people, even relatives of mine, have come to me and said, I'm giving a maid of honor speech at a wedding, can you help me craft my speech? And I'm like, I can help you craft it, but it's hard for me to watch you give it unless it's going to be amazing. So it's really hard for me. I don't like that feeling of saying that I've ruined some weddings. I haven't actually ruined them, but it's hard for me. I've had some weddings ruined for me from bad wedding toasts. Worse than that, unfortunately, I have to say I've actually seen some pretty bad eulogies, and I don't say that in the sense that I'm judging them. Obviously, people are caught up in the moment, and it's very hard to give a speech for someone that you care about who's recently passed away. I'm not here to judge someone giving a eulogy. If anyone's going to judge you for giving a eulogy, they're probably not the kind of person you want to associate with anyway. But there are certain conventions and expectations that go with a eulogy. So one of the bad examples that I've seen a few years ago was that one of my mentors passed away, and I went to his funeral, and the person officiating the ceremony knew him pretty closely but didn't say anything personal about him at all. And everybody else in the room had something very personal to say. This guy had known my advisor for like 20 years, had nothing personal to say about him, and it was kind of like, well, why are you officiating the ceremony if you're not going to talk about the person who's died? So there's a little bit of a curse of studying public speaking and knowing it as well as I do. I'm hoping that that's not the case for you all and that you can still enjoy some of these speeches that you all see. But I want to start with some of the bad examples that I've seen because I think it gets a lot of people thinking critically about how they might give ceremonial speeches on their own. Like I said, all of you will probably give ceremonial speeches at some point. Usually many points in your lives you'll be asked to do ceremonial speeches. So I want to make sure you do it well. So we're going to start off by talking about wedding toasts. I'm not going to switch to the next slide yet, but I'm curious if you can just collectively answer the question, what makes for a good wedding toast? How do you know if there's a good one? Have any of you been to weddings before? What makes a good wedding toast? Okay, so sometimes we like humor in wedding toasts. Okay. What else usually makes for a good one? Okay, so it makes proposals for the longevity of the marriage, maybe offers the couple some advice about marriage, or at least talks about the couple as a couple. Are there other things we can think of that good wedding toasts will do? Okay, so it invites an emotional response in the audience. Usually it's something kind of sweet, and we like to feel good about being there and celebrating this couple together. Any other good things we can say about wedding toasts? Okay, so let's imagine for a minute, what are some things that would make for a very bad wedding toast? You all know of some of them, I'm sure. You might not have been to weddings yet, but you can imagine. What are some things? Okay, saying bad things about the couple could easily make it go bad. Yeah. Okay, drunk speakers, absolutely. Lots of people drink at weddings. I've seen actually very bad drunk wedding toasts from best men or maids of honor, or even the parents of the bride and groom sometimes get a little bit too much to drink, and got to be careful with that. Bad humor, right. We talked a lot about saying that humor can sometimes be effective, but there's kind of this fine line between funny and borderline offensive. I've seen some examples, for instance, of brides and grooms cringing because somebody from college told this story of, remember that time sophomore year when we got drunk and they go on this 5-minute long story and grandma's sitting there in the front row, right? You don't want to make your friends cringe. Yes, you can tell a little bit of embarrassing stories, but be careful how much you do. Any other things that we can think of that might violate the expectation of a good wedding toast? Too long. Show on your hands how long you think a wedding toast should be. You can use both hands. You can use multiple hands if you think you need. I'm seeing a couple people say 5-6 minutes, 3, 4, lots of 5s, couple 2s, right? Lots of people say probably like 4 or 5 minutes is pretty typical for a wedding toast. I kid you not, I've seen a wedding toast go on for 18 minutes. That's way too long. This guy told his whole life story with the groom. It was kind of a disaster. It took forever. Some people will go a little bit overboard on style as well. So I actually remember a wedding where the bridesmaids got together and decided to sing to the bride. And it was not very well planned, it was not very well rehearsed, and it was off key, and the bride is sitting there like, can this be over, please, get this over. So be careful with what you want to do with your wedding toast, because sometimes they can go horribly wrong. Another thing that I've also seen go wrong is people will use it as an occasion to talk about themselves and their relationship with the bride and groom. They'll get a little bit too detailed in their own history. A lot of people in my classes yesterday talked about inside jokes, that if you've known this couple or if you've known one of the people in the couple for 15 or 20 years, you probably have some inside jokes, you probably have some stories that you can share without having to tell the whole story or using the exact language that everyone in the audience can understand. You want to be careful with that as well, because you're going to lose your audience, and you might lose the couple a little bit too if you get too into inside joke land. So be careful with some of these things here. I mentioned that I don't usually like when people take pictures of my PowerPoint slides. This one is one where I'm going to let you go ahead and take out your phones. This is another one of those things that I think you'll want to hang on to for a long time. This isn't my list of things to do for wedding toasts, but it's my friend Andrea Terry's list. Andrea teaches at Cal Poly. She's wonderful. I think this is a pretty handy list of some common things to remember. Like I said, with ceremonial speaking, a lot of people forget some of the conventions of standard public speaking, and they think that they don't need an intro, body, and conclusion, but usually you do, or they don't deliver their speech extemporaneously, and usually it doesn't go so well if they don't. So be prepared. Hopefully you can use this for the time being and in the future. Save it on your phones, and that way you'll have a copy of it, and I don't have to print out 300 copies. Cool. We're going to move on then to a couple other genres. I told you that some of the today was going to be talking about things that are good and things that aren't so good with ceremonial speaking. We're also going to talk about some genres of ceremonial speaking and just get some conversations going about them. So we're going to watch some examples here. One of those examples is a national eulogy. I'm curious, how old were some of you, again, show of hands, how old were some of you in September 2001 when 9/11 happened? Yeah, I've been teaching for about 8 years, and it's been interesting for me to watch the change. I'm seeing a lot of 2s and 3s, right? A lot of you are pretty little. I'm curious if anyone in the room remembers watching President George W. Bush giving this eulogy, either watching it the day of or watching it later on, a couple years later. A handful of people in here, but not really too many of you. So the genre of a eulogy is really tricky. For a lot of people, it's one of the hardest genres to give. I've had to give a few eulogies, unfortunately. They're not easy to do. I'm curious if you can think of some strategies for how to give a good eulogy. Again, like with wedding toasts, what are some things that make eulogies powerful? Are there any things that you can do to make it easier for you or for members of the audience? Yeah. Okay, so you might tell a funny story about that person. Usually funerals are kind of a sad time, so if we can lighten the mood a little bit. Again, being careful with that use of humor, but certainly something to keep in mind. Are there other strategies that you can think of?
Actually show remorse rather than just being like a super monotone.
Yeah, so actually being okay showing your emotions. I was really impressed last semester when one of my students legitimately raised their hand and asked the question, is it okay to cry when you're giving a eulogy? And my answer to that was actually that I think it's absolutely okay to cry. And even if I don't think it's okay to cry, a lot of people won't judge you for crying. In fact, they might judge you for not crying. The best advice that I have there actually comes from a trip that I went on a couple years ago. I was in Poland in 2004. I went on a trip with about 60 other people from around the United States. We were there for a week. We were there explicitly to go to visit concentration camps and the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto. We were there for a week, and before we went on our trip advisor, or our trip coordinator got together, got all of the group together in New York, and she said something to us that I'll never forget. And she said, there are going to be times on this trip when you want to cry, and you're going to be so overwhelmed with emotion that it's not going to come out. There are going to be other times on this trip where you don't know why you're crying, and you won't be able to stop. And I'll tell you that for all 60 of us on that trip, that was true. We all talked about it the week later, about those times that really caught us off guard, that we just couldn't stop crying. I'll tell you that in 2011, I lost my father, and we had a couple different ceremonies to commemorate his loss. And at the first one, I barely made it through my speech because I started crying in the middle of it. By the second or third one, we had different groups each night. It was a little bit easier, but it's still really tough, and you don't know how you're going to react in that moment. So aside from that, are there other things that make eulogies particularly difficult to do well? Are there other things that you find challenging?
I think describing your emotional state towards that person in an accurate way, or in a way that articulates it well enough to be heard. Your expectation is the hardest part of it.
Yeah, we talk about the Kubler-Ross model of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are not necessarily a linear process. Kubler-Ross didn't intend them to be a linear process. So you're experiencing a lot of different emotions when somebody dies. You might be in more than one of those at the same time. So you might be sad and angry and confused. You might have a complicated relationship with that person. So keeping your own emotions in check and trying to figure out which emotions and which stories are appropriate to share and which ones might not be can be really hard. When you're in this unfortunate situation, when you're confronted with a eulogy, I recommend that you talk to people about the eulogy that you're going to give and share some ideas and see how they react to it before you actually have to give it. Can you think of any other reasons why eulogies might be particularly difficult? I'll give you one more, and that is that when I lost my father in 2011, I lost him to a heart attack. And we didn't expect to lose him. He passed away in his sleep at about 2 in the morning. I got a phone call at 6 in the morning. I was living 1,200 miles from my family. I flew home, and the next day I had to give a speech. So we've talked about the 5 canons as a process. When we're talking about eulogies, sometimes that process has to be really quick because you don't necessarily expect someone to die, and suddenly you have to deal with your own grief and go through writing a speech at the same time. It's not particularly easy to do. So I'd encourage you to figure out how you might respond to some of those challenges. One thing that you might consider is actually taking stock of the people in your life and actually thinking about what are some things that I would want to say about this person, not in a very morbid way that you wish ill on any of them, but what are some things that I really want to make sure I remember in those difficult moments. It's really hard to give a eulogy. It's very hard to do it well. We're going to watch an example of a national eulogy. I asked how many of you had seen this speech before, and only a couple hands went up. This is President Bush after 9/11, and I'm curious, for those of you who were pretty young during 9/11, you probably didn't really have much memory of your own about 9/11. A lot of what you know about 9/11 is probably crafted from what other people have told you about that day. So maybe you talked about it in school growing up. Maybe you had ceremonies every year in school. Maybe you talked about it in a history class. Maybe you've asked your parents, what do you know about the timing? So he gives this speech in the evening that day. The attacks had happened in the morning. What are some things that you know about the rhetorical situation that President Bush might have been facing on that day when he's about to give this speech? Before we watch it. Yeah.
There was no certainty that the attack was over yet.
Okay, yeah, a lot of people were concerned because they hadn't seen an attack on this scale. Maybe there were some people who had lived through Pearl Harbor who also lived through 9/11. But basically, we hadn't had an attack on this scale on US soil in a very long time. A lot of people were very afraid that there were multiple attacks happening in the same day. They weren't sure if the attacks were over, if there were going to be more attacks coming. Good. What else do you know about the rhetorical situation that he faced? Yeah. Yeah, he had spent a lot of the day aboard Air Force One traveling. In the morning, he was reading to school children, I want to say in Florida. I think you're right about that. By the evening, he was obviously in Washington, D.C., so he had spent some time on a plane and traveling and was processing this message himself, everything that had been going on. What else do we know about 9/11? And the moment under which he'd give this speech. Okay, they were still looking for survivors in the wreckage. A lot of people didn't know if their loved ones were safe yet. A lot of people were very scared. A lot of people were expecting attacks to happen where they were. I was living in Minneapolis at the time, and I remember on the news for like 3 weeks, they wouldn't stop talking about how there might be a terrorist attack at the Mall of America. And everyone was really concerned about security, and I took that as a microcosm of everyone across the country being afraid that some attack could happen in the space where they lived. Okay. Are there any other things that might have made this speech powerful or challenging, given the context?
The president rarely addresses the nation.
Okay, the president doesn't address the nation all that often. So as you watch this speech, I want you to think through what are some things that he says, what are some things that he doesn't say, and if you could imagine him giving a different speech than the one he actually gives. We're going to watch President Bush's speech. I want you to think through what are some things he does well, what are some things that he might work on or might do differently, or if you were giving this speech, would you change any part of it?
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington which had to be evacuated today are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
So I recognize that for those of you seeing this for the first time, we're a little bit removed from it, but it's still pretty heavy. 9/11 still weighs pretty heavily on our national discourse. I'm curious, what are some things that you observed in this speech that surprised you? Yeah, he talked a lot. The message was very positive. A lot of people in my classes yesterday said that as well, that maybe we would expect him to be a little bit more angry or maybe a little bit less optimistic, but it's his job as commander-in-chief, as the president, as sort of a fatherly or perhaps priestly figure to get us calm after a lot of people are really anxious. So he has a lot of positive messages in this speech. One thing that I'll tell you is there's a second speech that he gives about a week later. That one is much less optimistic. It's much less positive. It's basically saying we're going to war, and he's pretty harsh and stern in his tone. But in this one, it's really calming. It's really reassuring as much as he possibly can be. It's positive. Okay. That's a really interesting point. Yeah, so she said she wouldn't start a speech on a day like 9/11 with good evening because good implies a value judgment. Really interesting, small observation, but a really important one. Yeah. Other thoughts? Other things that surprised you? Yeah.
I'd argue that his 9/11 full speech was better than this one.
His what?
His full speech.
Yeah, so his speech a week later?
I thought that was the best part.
You thought that was his best speech? Okay. So some of you have watched his other speech. If it interests you, if you don't know a whole lot about 9/11 history, I'd encourage you to watch these back to back. We don't have enough time to do that today, but for any of you who want to follow up on it. Other thoughts? Could you imagine this speech being otherwise? We had a little modification to it. Did you kind of walk into this speech knowing what he was going to say and how he was going to say it? One of you mentioned that presidents don't address the nation that often anymore, or maybe they never really did. When they do address the nation in a national eulogy, there are actually some pretty strong genre expectations. In fact, one of my former mentors, Carlin Corse Campbell at the University of Minnesota, has a piece where she talks about some of the things that presidents usually do in national eulogies, and a lot of them have to do with trying to heal the nation, trying to stay positive, trying to remember the dead, but also to remember the living. There's a lot of genre expectations that we would expect. We kind of expect the president to conclude with something like, thank you and God bless America. I mean, down to the little details. He probably had speechwriters helping him write this speech. Nevertheless, it was pretty powerful and pretty eloquent, and a lot of people said this was one of his best speeches that he ever gave. So the genre expectations here are actually pretty strong, and we can imagine that it would be hard for him to deliver the speech with a not so somber tone. It would be hard for him to deliver the speech not reading from a teleprompter. That's one of the things that a lot of people talk about. He's looking at the camera, and probably next to or above the camera is a teleprompter with the exact wording of his speech. This is one of those moments where it might be okay to give a manuscript speech because he's obviously practiced it quite a bit, and he has to get the wording exactly right because it's going to be recorded and it's going to be watched later. So that's another thing to keep in mind. A lot of people spoke of this as one of George Bush's most eloquent speech, and without getting too political, we're going to move to another genre that's going to pick on him a little bit. We're going to watch Robin Williams roast President George W. Bush. I'm curious, have any of you ever heard of the genre of a roast before? What is it? Yeah?
It's honoring them, but also making fun of them at the same time.
Good, yeah, it's usually honoring a person but also making fun of them at the same time. A roast is kind of like a satirical version of a toast. So we talked a lot about wedding toasts. Usually when people roast people, they roast people who have some kind of power. It's a fun way of challenging expectations about who the powerful people are. We tend to revere a lot of our heroes as heroes, and roasts are a fun way to kind of make us all human again and have a little bit of fun at that person's expense to change the power dynamics a little bit. So Comedy Central used to have roasts that they would do regularly of celebrities. There are some good ones of Pamela Anderson and Justin Bieber and whoever else you want to name. Robin Williams was probably roasted himself at one of those. I don't know. I haven't looked that up. But he nevertheless decided that he, after President Bush was out of office, wanted to roast Bush for not being as eloquent as he was when he had a teleprompter in front of him. A lot of critics of President Bush said he was not particularly intelligent and not particularly well-spoken, and as a result, he didn't make the best leader. And without getting too political here, I want you to think through what might be challenging about giving a roast. If you were asked to do this, or if you just decide to do it, what are some of the genre expectations of a roast, and what might be difficult about some of those expectations? Yeah?
It can be difficult to find the right balance between like honoring them and then also making fun of them, but not like making fun of them too much.
Good, yeah, so we talked about it as having two parts. It's kind of honoring someone, but it's honoring them in a backhanded way that's making fun of them. Finding the right balance between the two can be tricky. What else might be challenging here? Yeah, so if the message is a positive one, you don't want to be too critical of the person. A lot of times you'll have a relationship with the person that you're roasting, and it's pretty easy to damage that relationship pretty severely in a roast. There's a fine line between humor and offensive, and a lot of people will not be entirely clear on what that line is. Most of the time it depends on who is deciding what is and is not appropriate. There's not some clear-cut standard that we all agree upon of what is or is not appropriate. So Robin Williams is going to tackle George W. Bush. He's going to pick on him for not being particularly eloquent. And I'm interested in hearing sort of what the genre of a roast looks like to you and whether you think he did it well, regardless of your political stance. Is it too much? Is he kind of in that ballpark of that fine line between funny and offensive? Where is he here?
But we do have to take a moment of silence and bid a fond farewell to George W. Bush. Yes, it's the end of the reign of George II. The reign of error is over. America is officially out of rehab. Welcome. He is a gift to comedy, though he is a comedy pinata. I'm going to miss him. A man who said, I'm the decider. No, sir, you're the president. You make decisions. Deciders what they sell in a little jug. A lot of people, he also said, I have misunderestimated him. No, not really. You think, what is he going to do after he leaves office? No, he cannot go on a speaking tour. That's a given. But I do think he could do stand-up comedy because he has 8 years of amazing material. He has stuff, and here's some of W's greatest hits. The question that's never asked, is our children learning? I just found out that a lot of our imports come from other countries. America, a country where you can put food on your family. Our enemies are looking for terrible ways to destroy this country, and so are we. You have to have a little sympathy, though. W comes from a family where the smart brother is named Jeb. So you have to kind of take a moment, just a little moment of silence, and you can't.
So it's actually really interesting for me. I like showing this clip, not necessarily because of the message. I don't necessarily agree with Robin Williams here. I'm not interested in picking on people, but it's fun to kind of watch the audience because a bunch of you are laughing along, and the longer he talks, the more I can feel some of you getting super defensive and saying, whoa, you've crossed the line, buddy, right? A lot of the people in his audience are in a voluntary audience. They went to see him knowing that he's Robin Williams and that he was going to use some humor, that he might be pushing the envelope a little, that he might be offensive. Some of these people might have voted for President Bush or might at least support President Bush. It's kind of tricky to tell where that line is, but it's fun to watch all of you react to it when it's in play. So roasts can be really tricky because that line between what's funny and what's offensive is usually a fine line, and it's very easy to cross and very hard to come back from. We're going to talk about one more genre here, and that genre is the commencement speech. Graduation is coming, hopefully for some of you in a couple of weeks, or others of you in a couple of months or a couple of years. I see a couple empty chairs in here, so I'm hoping for those people maybe in a couple decades. But you all at some point will have commencement speeches once you graduate and leave UND, and I hope that your commencement speaker is inspirational. I hope that your commencement speaker makes you excited about your futures. I've already told you that at my high school graduation, I was pretty disappointed with both of our graduation speakers for violating the genre conventions of a commencement speech. I didn't tell you that at my college graduation, I was also very disappointed. I graduated college at the height of the recession, and our commencement speaker was a guy who had ran for governor and lost, and was not particularly inspirational. And he said his message to us on our graduation day, when all of us were nervous about getting jobs and whether there was any kind of future for us to use our degrees, he's like, well, I graduated in a recession and I turned out okay. That was his message for about 40 minutes. So I'm hoping that you all have a commencement speaker who's a little bit more inspirational than that. We're going to watch a sample of a commencement speech, and this is one that violates some expectations as well. Usually commencement speeches are very uplifting. They talk a very positive message. I really like J.K. Rowling's speech at Harvard from a few years ago. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but we're going to watch about half of it, and it's a little long. But I think you'll get the message, and I think you'll see why I chose to include it. J.K. Rowling violates the expectations of a graduation speech by talking a lot about failure. Which is really interesting. She actually talks a lot about her personal failures, and if you know J.K. Rowling, you know she's the brains behind the Harry Potter franchise and everything that's come of that, but before she was that, she really struggled a lot after her graduation, and so she has some messages, and it's telling that she also shares these messages at Harvard in a place where not a lot of people experience a lot of failure, and she talks about that a little bit in her speech. So if nothing else, if your commencement speaker in a couple weeks or months or decades is not particularly inspirational, know that there are good ones out there and that you can still feel really good about what you're doing with your degree from UND.
Delivering a commencement address is a great responsibility, or so I thought, until I cast my mind back to my own graduation. The commencement speaker that day was the distinguished British philosopher Baroness Mary Warner. Reflecting on her speech has helped me enormously in writing this one, because it turns out that I can't remember a single word she said. This liberating discovery enables me to proceed without any fear that I might inadvertently influence you to abandon promising careers in business, the law, or politics for the giddy delights of becoming a gay wizard. You see, if all you remember in years to come is the gay wizard joke, I've come out ahead of Baroness Mary Warner. Achievable goals, the first step to self-improvement. Actually, I have racked my mind and heart for what I ought to say to you today. I have asked myself what I wish I had known at my own graduation, and what important lessons I have learned in the 21 years that have expired between that day and this. I have come up with two answers. On this wonderful day when we are gathered together to celebrate your academic success, I have decided to talk to you about the benefits of failure. And as you stand on the threshold of what is sometimes called real life, I want to extol the crucial importance of imagination. These may seem quixotic or paradoxical choices, but bear with me. Looking back at the 21-year-old that I was at graduation is a slightly uncomfortable experience for the 42-year-old that she has become. Half my lifetime ago, I was striking an uneasy balance between the ambition I had for myself and what those closest to me expected of me. I was convinced that the only thing I wanted to do, ever, was write novels. However, my parents, was an amusing personal quirk that would never pay a mortgage or secure a pension. I know the irony strikes with the force of a cartoon anvil now. So they hoped that I would take a vocational degree. I wanted to study English literature. A compromise was reached that in retrospect satisfied nobody, and I went up to study modern languages. Hardly had my parents' car rounded the corner at the end of the road than I ditched German and scuttled off down the classics corridor. I cannot remember telling my parents that I was studying classics. They might well have found out for the first time on graduation day. Of all the subjects on this planet, I think they would have been hard put to name one less useful than Greek mythology when it came to securing the keys to an executive bathroom. Now, I would like to make it clear in parenthesis that I do not blame my parents for their point of view. There is an expiry date on blaming your parents for steering you in the wrong direction. The moment you are old enough to take the wheel, responsibility lies with you. What is more, I cannot criticize my parents for hoping that I would never experience poverty. They had been poor themselves, and I have since been poor, and I quite agree with them that it is not an ennobling experience. Poverty entails fear and stress, and sometimes depression. It means 1,000 petty humiliations and hardships. Climbing out of poverty by your own efforts, that is something on which to pride yourself, but poverty itself is romanticized only by fools. What I feared most for myself at your age was not poverty, but failure. At your age, in spite of a distinct lack of motivation at university, where I had spent far too long in the coffee bar writing stories and far too little time at lectures, I had a knack for passing examinations, and that, for years, had been the measure of success in my life and that of my peers. Now, I am not dull enough to suppose that because you are young, gifted, and well-educated, you have never known heartbreak, hardship, or heartache. Talent and intelligence never yet inoculated anyone against the caprice of the fates, and I do not for a moment suppose that everyone here has enjoyed an existence of unruffled privilege and contentment. However, the fact that you are graduating from Harvard suggests that you are not very well acquainted with failure. You might be driven by a fear of failure quite as much as a desire for success. Indeed, your conception of failure might not be too far removed from the average person's idea of success. So high have you already flown?
So we're going to stop her there. You can imagine that her message gets much more powerful, much more optimistic when she gets past that failure. But she goes into a lot of detail talking about how difficult her life was at that point. She had a very short-lived marriage. She was having a hard time finding work. And nevertheless, she figured out how to make things work for herself. And you can watch the rest of that speech if it interests you. That'll take us to our participation question for the day. So remember to take out a sheet of paper, put your lab instructor's name, your lab section number, and finally your answer to the following question. Your question is, which type of ceremonial speech do you think would be the hardest for you to give? I've listed a couple options here. You could list one of your own if you don't like the options I've given you, but I'm curious, which one do you think would be the hardest for you to give? And you don't necessarily have to write down why, but I'd like you to think about why. And the reason for that is because that way you can be prepared to know that that kind of speech might be difficult for you if you're ever asked to give it, and you might be able to strategize how you might do it a little bit better. So go ahead and put your name, your lab instructor's name, your section number, and your answer to the question. When you're done with that, you can put them in the folder up here, and you are free to go. I'll see you next week. Hope that you feel inspired and ready to finish the rest of the semester and the rest of your studies.